In the 24th psychological observation from studies in pessimism, Schopenhauer describes four different types of human being, which he argues have different levels of consciousness and consequently different levels of reality, of existence. I'll call these the worker, the merchant, the scholar, and the philosopher or poet. This passage invites an obvious comparison and connection to some of Nietzsche's thoughts about the order of rank between different human types and the will to power, so I invite you to think about that. This time I will read the passage all the way through and offer all of my commentary at the end. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. Intellects differ from one another in a very real and fundamental way. But no comparison can be well made by merely general observations. It is necessary to come close and to go into details, for the difference that exists cannot be seen from afar, and it is not easy to judge by outward appearances, as in the several cases of education, leisure, and occupation. But even judging by these alone, it must be admitted that many a man has a degree of existence at least 10 times as high as another. In other words, exists 10 times as much. I am not speaking here of savages, whose life is often only 1 degree above that of the apes in the woods. Consider, for instance, a porter in Naples or Venice. In the north of Europe, solicitude for the winter months makes people more thoughtful and therefore reflective. Look at the life he leads, from its beginning to its end. Driven by poverty, living on his physical strength, meeting the needs of every day, nay, of every hour, by hard work, great effort, constant tumult, want in all its forms, no care for the morrow, his only comfort, rest after exhaustion, continuous quarreling, not a moment free for reflection, such sensual delights as a mild climate and only just sufficient food will permit of, and then finally, as the metaphysical element, the crass superstition of his church. The whole forming a manner of life with only a low degree of consciousness, where a man hustles, or rather is hustled, through his existence. This restless and confused dream forms the life of how many millions? Such men think only just so much as is necessary to carry out their will for the moment. They never reflect upon their life as a connected whole, let alone then upon existence in general. To a certain extent they may be said to exist without really knowing it. The existence of the mobsman or the slave, who lives on in this unthinking way, stands very much nearer than ours to that of the brute, which is confined entirely to the present moment. But for that very reason, it also has less of pain in it than ours. Nay, since all pleasure is in its nature negative, that is to say, consists in freedom from some form of misery or need, the constant and rapid interchange between setting about something and getting it done, which is the permanent accompaniment of the work they do, and then again the augmented form which this takes when they go from work to rest and the satisfaction of their needs, all this gives them a constant source of enjoyment. And the fact that it is much commoner to see happy faces amongst the poor than amongst the rich is a sure proof that it is used to good advantage. Passing from this kind of man, consider next the sober, sensible merchant, who leads a life of speculation, thinks long over his plans and carries them out with great care, founds a house and provides for his wife, his children and descendants, takes his share, too, in the life of a community. It is obvious that a man like this has a much higher degree of consciousness than the former, and so his existence has a higher degree of reality. Then look at the man of learning who investigates, it may be, the history of the past. He will have reached the point at which a man becomes conscious of existence as a whole, sees beyond the period of his own life, beyond his own personal interests, thinking over the whole course of the world's history. Then finally, look at the poet or the philosopher, in whom reflection has reached such a height that instead of being drawn on to investigate any one particular phenomenon of existence, he stands in amazement before existence itself, this great sphinx, and makes it his problem. In him, consciousness has reached the degree of clearness at which it embraces the world itself. His intellect has completely abandoned its function as the servant of his will, and now holds the world before him, and the world calls upon him much more to examine and consider it than to play a part in it himself. If, then, the degree of consciousness is the degree of reality, such a man will be said to exist most of all, and there will be sense and significance in so describing him. Between the two extremes here sketched, and the intervening stages, everyone will be able to find the place at which he himself stands. So that's the end of Schopenhauer, of this passage of Schopenhauer. And we have an interesting meditation upon the nature of human consciousness, and he says this tenfold increase in reality by the philosopher or poet over the brutish type of worker. So let's just review what Schopenhauer has told us. There are millions of people, he thinks of the warm climate of the south of Italy, Naples and elsewhere, where a man might engage in this constant labor, just barely meeting the needs of life. He is brutish, he is unreflective, he lives in the present moment, more or less, like an animal, as we heard talked about before. He has less pleasure than higher types of man, but also less pain. And since pain is the primary thing in life, he seems to be making out rather better. In fact, the constant tumult of his life and the regular exchange of struggle and work for relaxation and the meeting of desire, we might say the sort of activity of his will and the satisfaction of his will, frequently alternating between them, gives his life a certain kind of enjoyment and satisfaction. We move up next to this slightly higher kind of human being, the merchant, the respectable person, the person who makes plans and acts on plans, who has a thought for the future, but it's a kind of worldly future, right? This is the sort of temporality of the bourgeois middle class, right? Who wishes to be responsible, who makes plans, who is active in his community, who provides for his family, who thinks for his descendants, but is still, I think, confined by this kind of ideal of social respectability that we associate with the bourgeois. We move then to the man of learning, the scholar, perhaps the historian, who has begun to contemplate existence itself, who sees now beyond his own lifetime and beyond the utility of simply providing for his lifetime, or even by inheritance or life insurance providing for his descendants. He's now beginning to, at the early stages of thinking about the world as a whole. And he's achieved a certain kind of impersonal relation to the world as an object of his knowledge. And then finally, I think Schopenhauer indicates that it's the poet or the philosopher who completes and perfects this type of engagement with the real by achieving, he says, first a greater clarity, and we might say greater comprehensiveness as well. He's able to think of existence itself, and this is the point at which intellect has slipped the leash that will normally holds it on. The intellect is no longer serving the will to achieve what the object strived for, but rather is contemplating the world as it is, taking in the overall drama of existence itself. And it's achieving here a certain kind of passivity, right? It no longer wants to do, it's no longer called by the universe to do things within it, but simply to contemplate it and to think about it, to know it. And this is the place where kind of the figure of the Eastern sage or holy man who has ascended to a higher level of consciousness really comes into play. So those are the four types of Schopenhauer. And I think we might be justly troubled by this assignment of a greater degree of reality to some humans rather than to others, especially this association of the common run of man, especially in the warmer climates where people can live simply with a minimal amount of work, with the brutes and the lower forms of people. I think the history of the 20th century should make us at least a little bit disquieted about this type of suggestion. And I can offer two things in mitigation of this sort of ill ease we might feel at Schopenhauer's analysis. We might say the kind of the metaphysics of different types of human consciousness. The first is that Schopenhauer has spoken before about the attitude of contempt that the superior person might feel for the inferior. But he's also noted this does not call forth hatred or violence on the part of the higher for the lower. In fact, rather the opposite. There's a certain kind of solicitude that awareness of one's own superiority inspires towards the lower orders, because the superior man really just wants to be left alone. And so he may nod and cooperate and smile and even be quite friendly with people for whom he has contempt. So this idea that contempt leads to hatred and to violence, I think, is a mistake. And I think recognizing that might humanize Schopenhauer's analysis of the greater reality of these higher types of persons. And secondly, I want to note that, especially with this final observation, that between these two extremes, everyone can find his current location. That invites us, I think, to think of Schopenhauer's categories here not merely as placing each of us in relation to our fellow man, right? Am I one of this class, or one of these higher classes that has more reality to it? He's also describing, I think, stages of our own internal psychological growth, I'd say spiritual progress in a Schopenhauerian sense. I've risen above the brutish level to the bourgeois level. Perhaps I've begun to break through to the scholar level with the ambition of eventually freeing my intellect more and more from my will. So if we think of this as a recipe for personal growth and a way of reminding us that here are the characteristics of the sort of bourgeois merchant stage of individual psychology, I have to be careful that I rise beyond that. I don't want to slide back into it. I want to comport myself and adjust my mind and my priorities and the way I live my life and conceive of myself in a way that is going to lead to a greater and greater detachment of my intellect from my will, rising more towards this kind of intellectual contemplation of the whole of existence. So even if I can't live that way all the time, or I'm currently at one state, I can situate myself here without coming to judgments about the moral worth or the political systems that should govern people at different levels of reality. Okay. That said, by mitigation, I might further add as a third point, I do recollect that C.S. Lewis used a similar metaphor here in The Great Divorce in talking about the progress of souls towards the heavenly afterlife as a matter of their acquiring a greater kind of density and solidity. People who first arrive at the purgatorial place are kind of ghostly and barely there, and as they move forward, as they make progress, they sort of fill in their outline and become denser, they become more solid as they go along, they acquire a greater degree of reality. So I'd say those three things in mitigation of any discomfort we might feel about hearing Schopenhauer describe to us in detail how certain types of human beings have a higher degree of consciousness, which makes them 10 times more real or gives them a higher degree of existence than other human beings. So that's all for this observation. We'll look at the 25th observation in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.